Hello and welcome to Banjo Strings and Drinking Gourds, How America Culture Came to Be, the podcast of the Frontier Culture Museum of Virginia. I'm Alex.
And I'm Rachel. Today we're deviating from purely historical topics to bring you a little bit of a lighter episode. We're asking interpreters to talk about how they interact with history as presented by pop culture. Now, historians have a reputation for being sticklers, but everyone enjoys some escapism now and then. There's a bit more of a tendency to nitpick, I think, and I know that I'm definitely guilty of enjoying a running commentary, but polling our coworkers on different opinions about history as portrayed in pop culture has been fascinating.
Yes, we've definitely seen some interesting range of opinions and sparked some rather virulent debates, but this is a very interesting topic and something that should give our listeners a bit of a behind-the-curtain treatment into what our breakroom can devolve into.
There were definitely some heated discussions once this podcast topic was broached. Some passionately defending a film, and others expressing vehement dislike of the same, and surprisingly often for the same reasons. But what we did find is that history is everywhere in pop culture.
We're definitely surrounded and exposed to it more than we think, and that's not a bad thing. A lot of the interpreters seem to remember certain films or books as actually sparking their interest in history, even if the media wasn't exactly historically reliable. So honestly, I'm not bothered by how the history is presented as long as it's inspiring someone to look up the actual events. Unless it's about one of my personal favorite events or periods, then it must be 100% accurate.
We do have our niche areas that we'll defend. But yeah, inspiring people to look into history is a great gateway into actually learning about history. How many of us looked forward to movie day in history class, even if we may have to analyze the movie later? And look at Hamilton and the success there. It's a fresh look at a series of events and people that can be dry and dull to read about, but turn it into a rap musical with actors all being people of color, and you've captured the attention of most of the world. Now, were there some liberties taken? You bet. As the saying goes, don't let the truth get in the way of a good story. But how many younger people took to TikTok and Twitter to talk about what they learned had actually happened? That's a win for my book. And really, the more historically accurate, the more likely it is to find the wider public doesn't enjoy it. Hence why Hollywood likes to play around with creating a narrative out of a sequence of events, adding romance or drama where they might not have existed.
And part of the fun of pop culture is definitely the possibility to play what if. Time travel or plots based on alternative realities can be great fun and can also make you think about deep topics, like how one small change in a historic event could have resulted in big changes to our time. Most long-running TV shows in fantasy science fiction have at least played the what ifs. Even long-running straight dramas have occasionally dabbled in retrospective episodes set decades or centuries before the events of the main characters. Jag comes to mind, as so does Yellowstone spin-off of 1883, or my favorite, Doctor Who.
So in organizing the overwhelming response to our call for answers in this episode, we realized that it's nearly impossible to actually categorize people's feelings about the broad range of historically influenced pop culture. We ended up trying to organize everyone's responses by 3 general categories. Pop culture they liked because of the historical accuracy, things they disliked because of the historical inaccuracy, and those they liked despite the historical issues.
So let us get us started. Here is a few select answers about pop culture the interpreters liked because of the historical accuracy.
One of my most favorite historically accurate movies is actually Emma, that was done in 2020, and it's a love letter to Jane Austen's world, and especially they really took the time to research the costumes and also the interior design. So that's probably in my top tier. Second would be actually Little Women 1994. The 2019 version, while it's really great, isn't very historically accurate at points. So I feel like the 1994 one does a little bit better handling some of the costumes. However, there are a few pieces here and there that are a little out of the time period, but they don't feel jarring.
I might choose Saving Private Ryan because I heard from people in the know that it was historically accurate. The fact that it created a visceral response to those who had actually lived through that era and experienced that situation gave, in my opinion, a lot of credence to Saving Private Ryan, that they did it right, that the director, the producers, and the actors all had that goal of doing it right to elicit that kind of response from the viewer. So I enjoyed that. Saving Private Ryan, Schindler's List, those are 2 movies that I've watched once. I will never watch them again. because I don't need to, because they disturb me, because the history I think was fairly correct in both of those. And so also often historic fiction will, it'll create an emotional response in me that I don't want to repeat again. But those two movies, I'll never watch them again.
I would like to talk a little bit about a movie that's actually more recent, which kind of breaks the rules of what we were saying we were going to cover for our podcast, but I hope you'll understand why I'm reviewing this more modern movie. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Smoke Signals. Smoke Signals is a 1998 coming-of-age movie that revolves around Victor and Thomas, the main characters, as they travel from the Coeur d'Alene Reservation in Washington State to Arizona to collect Victor's father's ashes. And this movie, it actually breaks a long Hollywood tradition of freezing Native peoples in time. And it explores indigeneity and what it means to be Native in a contemporary context. Vine Deloria Jr., a Native legal scholar, says that one of the best ways to understand a people is to know what makes them laugh. And Smoke Signals heavily relies on humor. Now, it does cover very hard subjects, but it's not mythologized. These are not warriors that are set in the past. And, it doesn't represent all aspects of indigeneity, and it can't cover all of the origin stories or the histories or the traditions of the over 570 federally recognized tribes, but it does explore what being Indigenous means using the main characters, and it does show how the perceptions of Native peoples are colored by colonization. And it asks the question of what it means to belong to a community that is misunderstood. So like I said, it does have some very humorous moments, like when Victor asks Thomas what it means to be a real Indian. He finds out that Thomas has seen dances with wolves upwards of 200 times. Now, of course, that representation is faulty because it traps Native cultures in a past that only serves to further othering and the perceived extinction of Native peoples. Another thing it does is it heavily relies on oral traditions, or it features flashbacks that are narrated and heavily relies on oral tradition. In one scene, the protagonist, Victor, tells his mother about his trip to Arizona with the other main character, Thomas. Victor's mother is nervous about him returning, and Victor asks if she would like him to sign a paper promising his return. That prompts her to say, "You know how Indians feel about signing papers. Promise me." His mother's insistence on spoken word over written is just one moment in which a Native person insists upon cultural sovereignty in the representation of Native peoples. Now, there have been many other shows and movies that have been produced after this, and they do continue to explore this idea of what it means to be Native in a contemporary society. And for this reason alone, I hope that some of you might be encouraged to watch Smoke Signals, because Native cultures are not trapped in the past.
So one movie that I greatly enjoy for its historical accuracy, and it's kind of a weird answer, but is the movie Sweet Liberty with Alan Alda. The movie, so it's kind of a meta approach to this question, but the movie is sort of a spoof movie about the filming of a Revolutionary War film, where the author, played by Alan Alda, is basically watching a director and producers from Hollywood take a fairly well-written history book and absolutely trash it, trying to make it this weird, goofy comedy action movie. The cooler thing that I sort of see throughout the process is how this movie and how they're showing interactions between reenactors and the production, in that, it's usually the case, unfortunately, a lot of times with movies, that we as historians and reenactors sort of hope for the best, fear for the worst and often see something in the middle. And some movies are painfully inaccurate, often really at the behest of Hollywood or the audience not understanding things. One of the best examples that comes to mind when talking about The Patriot is that all of the dragoons, who are all loosely based on loyalist dragoons, all should be wearing green coats in the movie, and the production company puts them in red because, well, but the bad guys, the British, wore red, so we have to put them in red, which is just a glaring inaccuracy that really accomplishes almost nothing. Which, funny enough, even though Sweet Liberty predates the filming of The Patriot by, I think, close to a decade, they hit that exact point and hit it absolutely correctly. So it's really comical. I haven't had the opportunity to be on any film sets, but having had friends and colleagues who have, it usually is very much the case that the reenactors who have spent an awful lot of time and an awful lot of sort of effort in making sure that they are historically accurate and that their kit is historically accurate, get to a film set and are almost just treated as mildly warm bodies that are almost an annoyance in that they're getting in the way of the machine that is a production. So it's a very funny movie. The uniforms are not all that bad. And it weirdly, even though it predates The Patriot, is almost, I would guess, to be a shot-for-shot documentary of what the production of The Patriot seems to have been like, which is kind of cool.
And those that couldn't stand a movie because of the excessive inaccuracies.
I don't always tend to watch historical fiction movies for a simple reason. I don't want to put myself through it sometimes. I don't want to see what I would think are anachronisms or wrong values or things like that. I just don't want to go through it. If it's a movie about 1850 something, I want it to be about 1850 something, and I want that movie to capture 1850 something as I know it. Now, do I know everything? Of course not. But I have a pretty good guess. I have an educated way of looking at these things. So sometimes I just choose not to watch a historic fiction movie. And so I'll turn to something else like Marvel or something like that.
One show that I will say that I pretty well despise is the show, and it was on Netflix, who knows where it is now, Frontier with Jason Momoa. And weirdly, I have some insider information that I'm very happy to share on this. For me, as the tailor at the museum and someone who is very dedicated and interested in material culture and particularly clothing, clothing is usually one of the first things I look for in just about any film in reference to the 18th century. And unfortunately, Frontier is one that pretty heavily misses the mark. Weirdly enough, and as I recall, the date on that is supposed to be somewhere maybe in the 1780s or 90s. The clothing is a mishmash of kind of French and Indian War stuff, kind of 19th century stuff, Revolutionary War stuff thrown in the mix, and it's just an absolute dumpster fire. The story itself, to be honest, is just not all that interesting and not all that appealing to follow. And after about eight episodes that I forced myself through, I pretty much dropped the show and I never went back. But in general, it's just so hard to get past poor material culture. So interestingly enough, I kind of was interested in trying to get more information on where this dumpster fire started and how it got to that point. So I actually reached out and talked to one of the people that was not the main costumer, but an assistant costumer on the show. And this is what I found. Basically, they started out by renting a number of costume pieces, which often were just being used for background and extras. And funny enough, that's some of the best clothing on the show. So those are pretty basic, British regimental uniforms. While not totally appropriate for what they were doing, they look halfway decent. The next category of costume were costumes that they consciously made for the production. So one of them is worn by this weird, aggressive British officer. The coat could be best described as like French and Indian War cosplay. and he wears a full beard, which is kind of not a thing in the 18th century at all, particularly for military stuff. So it's really weird and really strange and really out there. That coat looks kind of okay, though, but a lot of the other clothing that I was told that they made is actually really bad and really ill-fitting, seemingly made out of a lot of cotton. And in just general, it's enough to take you out of the immersive experience that you would think that they're trying to present. The third category of clothing is the great Jason Momoa, which Jason Momoa is fine. He's an interesting Aquaman. It seems to me in many cases he plays almost the same role, or the same person in just about every role. The only difference maybe is when he was Khal Drogo in Game of Thrones, he didn't speak English, so I guess that's a thing. But interestingly enough, the information I got about Jason Momoa is he got to set for the filming of Frontier, which was filmed in Canada, and immediately looked at the clothing, which they made him, and recalled that some of the clothing they made was not very good, and decided, I'm not going to wear this, I don't like this. Called his stylist in Los Angeles, who then proceeded to send out a bunch of clothing for him to wear. The clothing that she sent were things like Carhartt tan pants, which, believe it or not, are not historically accurate to the 18th century. So, all things considered, you have just an absolute dumpster fire from all sorts of different perspectives, some of which were kind of the fault of the customers, and some of which actually were not at all. It was just Jason Momoa wanting to be a cool dude, but not a historically accurate cool dude. And for me, that's a big old F. And so that's why that's the show that I enjoy almost the least when it comes to historical accuracy.
So the historical films that I don't particularly love are New World. And it's not so much a hate on the costume pieces or any of the research that's done in the film. It's more just the script itself was boring, and I found the storyline to also be lacking. The other one, I have a hate-love relationship with Outlander. I love Outlander at times. I hate Outlander at times. Mainly, again, it's not so much the historical accuracy, although there are some blatantly obvious historical inaccuracies in Outlander. I think it has more, again, to do with storylines and how certain traumatic events are handled. Not a big fan of.
One of the films that does show history that I just cannot recommend is A New World. Full disclosure, I used to work at Jamestown on the ships. I worked there after the movie was filmed. I knew many of the people that were extras in the film. And there's so much wrong in the movie that even the windows that movie could have theoretically given us into the real history is so obscured by the lousy history that it is presenting. So there's a lot of shots where of just nature, just long sweeping shots. And while we might think, oh, this is beautiful wilderness, it does not look like the wilderness that would have existed in 1607. The trees, all of it gives a portrayal that is just wrong for the way that the Virginias would have looked in that time period. There's also other myths and are being perpetuated. Probably the most significant is Pocahontas. Pocahontas in the movie is being depicted as an adult. That is not true. That is something that they would have known was untrue when they made the film, and would have been probably a young lady closer to 10, maybe 12 years of age, not someone more in their 20s. And John Smith was 26, 27, 28. There was no relationship. There was very little that those two would have had in interaction with each other, other than her being the daughter of Chief Powhatan when John Smith was captured and staying with Chief Powhatan. So it's one of the best scene in the movies is the end scene where the three ships are sailing away. And that is about all I could say. It's a long film. Guys, watch something else. Anything else. That one, you'll never get those hours back. And I'm sorry you guys had to watch it just recently.
Now, just for an experiment, Alex and I both selected a movie neither of us had seen, but was widely regarded as horrifically historically inaccurate when it came out. The two might be related, but our homework was to watch 2005's The New World and come to some kind of consensus on it.
Really? I hated it, but that's no surprise because I really don't like movies. It takes a long time to sit still, and this was a movie where I was fidgeting and waiting for it to end. Really, just wishing it would end.
Yes, that's definitely 3 hours of my life I will never get back. The acting wasn't terrible by any means, although how could it be with that cast? But, artistic liberties much? Also, dramatically slow scenes are slow.
The use of primary sources like Smith's journal added a sense of reality, but also a strong sense of racism, which it was prevalent in the period, of course, but jarring right off the bat, especially to audience members who didn't catch that that's what was happening. Of course, it does set up a nice sense of the extraordinary, surreal experience of two vastly different cultures meeting without any prior concept of the other.
I really did enjoy the material culture evident in pretty much every moment, especially the background settings. The Powhatan village made me pause certain scenes just to see what was in the corners. That's just another occupational hazard, I guess.
And this wasn't a random choice of film. We did actually select it because we have interpreters who formerly worked at Jamestown or with people who would actually be part of the film on the ships and have heard a whole passel of stories about the mass chaos and flailing that apparently is trying to make a modern film schedule fit with 17th century sailing equipment.
So, one of the stories that I was told from some of the extras that had been on the film was that after spending more than a few hours out late, they would come back onto set and they, for those nature shots, would deliberately tell the director and the cinematographer far out of the way locales that they just had to see at sunset or sunrise the next day. That's how some of that filmography ended up happening, is that they kept getting told where great vistas were located for the film. And this is a director who is noted for liking his broad vistas and views of nature with stirring music or less stirring music in the background. And in this particular work, it's something that probably adds a good hour to the runtime of this poor film. One of the reasons that the extras would provide this information was so that they could maybe get a good 2 to 4 hour nap in the middle of the day while the film team would go off to site and set up for those types of sweeping vista shots.
I'll say this one was more entertaining to make than watch, probably, but we do have to give credit that this was one of the first so-called blockbusters to purposely focus on native actors for native roles, even if appropriate tribal affiliation was a bit of a sticky spot. But since we didn't exactly like this one as an entertaining or historical experience, what's one of your guilty pleasures of historical movies that you like, Rachel?
I'm almost ashamed to admit it, but my go-to for a guilty pleasure movie is Colin Farrell's American Outlaws. Yeah, that one's missing a whole lot of historical accuracy. So it's telling the Jesse James story from the beginning, when they are part of the Confederate Army, going home, how the railroad comes in. Now, a lot of the general broad strokes are accurate in this, but honestly, I watch it more for the explosions and the action than anything else. What's yours, Alex?
To me, my favorite ones, it's a trio, but they're by the same group. It's Monty Python's Life of Brian, and then some of them did a movie called Jabberwocky, and then some of them did perhaps one of the strangest movies, The Adventures of Baron von Munchausen. I'm not even sure I pronounced that right. It's been so long since I've seen it. But what I liked about it was the scenes when they're in the villages, it's so filthy. It's so disgusted. And the silliness of it and how they just really make fun of courtly love at the time period, I find very amusing. And every time I watch them, I always laugh out loud. And here are some of the interpreters' responses about shows and movies they like despite themselves.
So, for movies that I love in spite of the fact that they're not historically accurate, I'm kind of torn and tied between two films, both of which have had a massive influence on living history, reenacting, and our perception of the 18th century. And those two films are Last of the Mohicans and The Patriot. And I've got to say, I love them both, and in spite of all their flaws, we'll watch them anytime they're on TV. So speaking to both of them, Last of the Mohicans, obviously based off of a book, so the question on historical accuracy can kind of be whether or not it's accurate to history or accurate to the book, and maybe it's a little bit 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. In general, the thing that I'm going to go back to all the time on Last of the Mohicans is vibes, in that it gives such a great vibe for really what ends up becoming the frontier experience, even though that's not 100% what they're going after. And even though, as far as when we're looking at how this influenced living history, at times Last of the Mohicans has influenced this weird long hunter, shooting guns from the hip and wearing pretty poor clothing sort of thing that we see in living history. It also just, in many cases, was the first experience for a lot of people or one of the first experiences for 18th century warfare and 18th century stuff. So if you were wanting to cosplay and be Hawkeye and go to a reenactment as Hawkeye, I would discourage that, in that, what he's wearing and what he does a lot of the time is not that accurate. Even though it's a really great scene towards the end, I don't know how he managed to reload multiple rifles and double fire 2 from the hip. But who cares? It's great anyway. That's the magic of it. The score, the sound, and again, just the feelings that come across in Last of the Mohicans make it a great film. And quite frankly, you could have a purple polka dot covered hippo run through the screen halfway through. It would still probably hold up as a great film. So I love that movie. The second one, and probably the one that is more in my heart, is definitely The Patriot. So The Patriot in general gets kind of heavily ragged on and besmirched, mostly by living historians and reenactors, for lack of historical accuracy on a number of fronts. And a lot of those criticisms are fair. So things like I brought up that, they changed all the loyalist codes from green to red because the bad guys are British and they have to wear red. Sure. Certain points where they deviated from anything close to historical fact. For example, Tavington in the movie, who's based on Bannister Tarleton, while he was a pretty wicked dude, though some of that is down to, where your source is coming from, he never did anything like burning down a church with people inside of it. So some of that stuff is pretty silly. Other things that were unnecessarily changed or added to the film don't help it in any way as far as a real view of the 18th century. Really great example of this, Mel Gibson's character is loosely based on Francis Marion and really a few other influential Southern officers. It's pretty much a fact that really all of those officers owned enslaved people. Like, that's just what it is. Making Mel Gibson's character this weird unicorn that didn't own slaves and had freed all of his slaves and was somehow on a moral high ground doesn't add anything. It actually kind of takes away from the fact that we can talk about the fact that the founding fathers were not without flaws, and that, they had morally bankrupt decisions on their conscience sometimes. And, anyone can sort of get onto that fact of, well, it was a different time. The fact of the matter is most founding fathers knew that they were owning enslaved people and knew that it was morally wrong and did it anyway. And that's something that The Patriot could have hit, and actually could have hit out of the park, even though that's not necessarily exactly what the movie's about. But the thing that I'll come back to over and over is there are such great moments and feelings in The Patriot, despite the fact that at times some of those moments are not historically accurate. And the thing I'll come back to over and over again is that the thing that the Patriot did so well was expose in a grand and epic feel 18th century history, Revolutionary War history, and military history in that context to a broader audience. That, I can say that if it wasn't for films like The Patriot, I never would have gone into history as a field. And I know a number of people that, wouldn't have as well. A bit on my background, I started out my career in history working at Colonial Williamsburg. And part of why I applied for the job was that I enjoyed The Patriot so much. And the night before I started, I watched The Patriot to really brush up on my history as an 18-year-old, and then proceeded to start working there and realize, oh, this movie's not very historically accurate at all, and I could have spent my time better by reading a book. But you live and you learn. But without that epic feel that The Patriot provides, I don't think I ever would have even bothered going down that path, and I know a lot of other people wouldn't have as well. In a certain way, you can almost think of The Patriot in the same way that some psychologists think of Sigmund Freud today. A lot of Freud's theories and a lot of his ideas were so out there and at times incorrect that for decades after the fact, psychologists spent the time trying to prove him wrong and going down research rabbit holes in order to do that. So the field of psychology is now more fleshed out as a result of that. And in many ways, Revolutionary War historians and 18th century military historians broadly have done the same thing, in that living history and reenacting, and even what we do here at the Frontier Culture Museum with our military impressions, has been informed and improved by wanting to give a more accurate view to the public than what The Patriot does, despite the fact that it's an awesome film. And again, it's a film I'll watch on TV anytime it's on.
So my guilty pleasures, I would probably say number one is Bridgerton. And there's definitely a difference between historical films and historical fantasy. And Bridgerton definitely falls under the historical fantasy, but I still love anything to do with historical fantasy. And that also applies to Anna Karenina, another historical fantastical story. Barkskins is another great one. Barkskins, there's a few, I wouldn't say historical inaccuracies as much. They, for the most part, have really great research, but my biggest thing is that they really try to pay respects to the Native community as best as possible for that show. And probably the others would be Last of Mohegans, because it's a classic. And Little House on the Prairie, surprisingly, is one of my most favorite shows growing up. And it's more to do with nostalgia, watching it with my mom and spending time with her. Maybe not so much about the actual show. Probably the show that got me involved in history was Little House on the Prairie. I read all of the books. I also watched the entire TV series growing up. The other, it's not a TV series or film series, but was the Dear America series. I read every single one of the Dear America and Royal Diaries books growing up, and felt like that really triggered my love for history.
Braveheart. Braveheart, my nickname for that one is Dead Men Do Wear Plaid. Because, it's full of historical inaccuracies. From costuming, from kilts and everything. And even though it's a good Mel Gibson film, and it's got a great storyline, it's just kind of inaccurate. And that's one that I will tend to spoof on sometimes. That one, and Patriot is another one. And I'm not picking on Mel Gibson here, but Patriot is another movie and I think what these movies are trying to do is they're trying to bring in certain elements of certain parts of history and put together a mix that maybe really didn't exist or would have been historically difficult to all merge together. So I think one of the critiques that I would have of Hollywood is they try to tell too many stories at once in a lot of these movies.
So in general, I really enjoy being able to go to the movie theaters and seeing a movie portraying a historic time period. Does a lot of great things for us here at the museums. It brings a new interest to a historic topic, a subject matter that it discusses, things of that nature. It sheds light onto a period of history. So some of the movies that we could watch, one of my favorite, even though it's absolutely historically inaccurate, is A Knight's Tale. A Knight's Tale, it's a comedy, it's about the Middle Ages, and it's basically set with a knight going around fighting and being a jousting tournament champion. Except he's not. And this is loosely based on the Canterbury Tales, A Knight's Tale. And you hear music in it, which is absolutely modern. And while it gets the material culture and a lot of the history kind of a little wrong, what it does do is catch the mood and the excitement that would have existed in the jousting tournament scene in the Middle Ages. So while as history, it's a bust, it is such a great introduction into the Middle Ages and into that part of it that it's a great movie to watch. Now, other films sometimes miss the mark. And while it's still great for our profession that there's been a movie that shed light on it, you could see a movie like The Patriot, which historically is got good costuming, story-wise is all over the place, and perpetuates a number of myths that we have to spend a lot of time as a profession trying to dispel, like a woodsman, a frontiersman coming in to fight against British soldiers really can't fire his musket that quickly and take out an entire company of men by himself. But despite the fact that it's historically pretty wrong, it still gives us a lot of time and a lot of windows for conversation into the events that those movies are portraying. So it's a mixed bag, but by and by, I really like that a lot of movies and films, and sometimes written stories as well, will shed light on a time period that we then can use as a window to educate people with. And that is one of the best things about history and popular culture intersecting together.
Now, pop culture doesn't have to be something you sit and stare at for a couple hours. Pop culture can also be historical fiction, which is a full range of accuracy all on its own. My favorites in this category, for example, are sometimes more based on myth, so the authors have a little more leeway in interpretation of events, but the settings, food, clothing can still be described to give the reader the proper feel. The Arthurian Saga series by Mary Stewart, for example, is wonderful for historical commentary. My absolute favorite historical fiction, however, is the Sister Fidelma series, which is written by Peter Beresford Ellis, a notable historian, under the nom de plume of Peter Tremaine. This series is about the early Irish church of the 7th century, with all the invasions, both physical and cultural, and the clashes between Roman and Irish ideologies. Because this is Ellis's academic wheelhouse, the books are chock full of both material culture and actual events, with a large smattering of Irish thrown in as well. I highly recommend.
My favorite historical fiction books are I, Claudius and Claudius the God by Robert Graves. I believe my grandfather gave them to me when I was a teenager, or he gave them to the family and encouraged us all to read them. And they were great, great books. They're one of the few books I've read almost from start to finish, right from the get-go. And I still, every once in a while, like to read them. And it's given me a fascination for Rome, which is strange because I spend most of my time here at the museum in the 17th century. But they were fantastic books. And I think they were the reason I studied history in college.
Even beyond books, however, pop culture and history are paired all around us. Naomi came up with a brilliant example that is both educational and enjoyable.
A big connection for me that, as a historian, that got me into history were the American Girl doll books. So I'm the youngest of 4 children. We were homeschooled. And our parents really encouraged us to be voracious readers. So, for example, one Christmas when I was about 10, my mom, I believe, got me the Felicity book. And I can't remember the name of the other, but they got me about 3 of those series. They also got me believe it's George Washington Carver's autobiography, Up From Slavery. So they got me a mix of historical fiction books and autobiography books from people in history. So as a young person, probably about 12, that really kind of helped launch me into my career. People ask me all the time, like, you probably don't make a lot of money in history. No, it's not something you go into to make a lot of money. But I think as a child, that really sparked my passion. I think pop culture can be a great hook for history. I've taught at the college level. I've taught, kindergartners and old people. At times, I think as historians, we can get maybe a little too academic, like, oh, poo-poo that, because maybe the movie Gettysburg is, like maybe really cheesy, or like, like this, Victorian, dress that has a zipper or something, or like, they're always wearing crushed velvet or something. Like, yes, I know those things bug me too, but just in my opinion as a historian and teaching, being in this field for about 10 years and being in museums, is sometimes I think maybe we should offer a little grace to our visitors and to our students, that we just have to get them in the door. And I think pop culture can be a good way to do that. Otherwise, I think they're going to continue to think of us, history and people that do history, is a dead dry thing, when it's not that. It's so exciting and it's invigorating, and it can change the future. It's not just dry dead things.
My daughter, when she was about 9 or 10, we gave her Felicity, and that doll went everywhere for us for a number of years, including to baseball games where she got distracted and gave it to me to hold, and then I got made fun of for holding a doll when I was my age, which really annoyed me to this day. And we even went to the American Girl doll restaurant. Yes, there is a restaurant where you can feed your doll and have a proper meal. Very bizarre, but it did make her like history, and we went to Williamsburg many times because Kitty Cat Felicity as a gift. Now, here is something that I find very interesting, is that it seems at that age between 9 and 12 that a lot of the history fiction and history books seem to be marketed to girls. There doesn't really seem to be anything for boys. Like Kitty read the American Girl dolls books that Naomi is talking about, which are pretty interesting, and I do believe they check their research very carefully. And for my son, there just doesn't seem to be anything like that.
Now, I'm going to take exception to that statement, Alex, because, for one, you're genderizing a book. It doesn't really matter what gender the protagonist is in a book. Anyone can sit and read a book and learn about history that way. Just because the protagonist happens to be female, look how many girls read Harry Potter. Harry's a boy, and he's the main character. Yes, you've got Hermione, but it didn't really matter who the main character was because the story was compelling enough. Same thing with, look at Hunger Games. Many, many boys enjoyed Hunger Games, even though Katniss is a female protagonist. So, with history, yes, I can see what you're saying about they're marketed more towards girls, but it doesn't really matter. As long as a child picks up a book and is reading about something in history and they're enjoying it, there's no such thing really as genderized literature.
Fair point. I agree with you. But truly, the American Girl dolls book series really is geared for girls.
It is, as long as you're also genderizing toys and girls being the ones that play with dolls, which has been had a large kickback in the parenting community in the last several years. It is also another way, again, as a hook. It is also a fact that any type of historical exposure early on is going to help a child have historical events capture their imagination.
And I'm going to end up where there is actually one history book that has a boy and girl protagonist, and I think it's called the Treehouse series, where they go into a treehouse and they go back into time at various places. Those are very good, and both of my kids loved them and read them frequently.
So really, just to summarize, it's not about the marketing. It's not about the gender of the protagonist. It's really how these books are presented to a child and if they choose to read them or not.
Yes, that is true.
So to summarize, ask anyone for their top 10 historical movies and you'll get 10 very different lists from any other person. Personal preference, interests, and a whole range of other factors play into the way a movie vibes with a person. And Hollywood doesn't actually seek to be that historically accurate. Movies, TV shows, musicals, books, video games, these should all be taken as little bits of human history made palatable by smoothing out the rough edges left by unknowns, by papering over the holes with relatable human characters instead of a two-dimensional description in a history text.
And we never know how a new approach to a very old story may grab your interest. Look at Hula's The Great, for example. Not a shining example of 100% historical accuracy, but a gripping, humorous, and dramatic approach to an incredible, complex period of Russian history. And really, we should all be a little concerned when something produced in modern times with modern people and equipment claims to be historically accurate or truthful. As the book, Past Imperfect, History According to Movies starts, like drama and fiction. Movies inspire and entertain. They do not provide a substitute for history that has been painstakingly assembled from the best possible evidence and analysts. But sometimes filmmakers, wholly smitten by their creations, proclaim them to be historically accurate or truthful, and many viewers presume them to be so. Viewers should never accept such claims or dismiss them out of hand, but regard them as an invitation for further exploration. By the way, even though this book is dated, first published in 1995 and therefore only included movies made before then, check it out. Historians go through 63 movies still regarded as some of the best in historic films.
So we hope you enjoyed this look behind the scenes into exactly what we talk about in our break room and how historians and historical interpreters actually feel about history as portrayed in pop culture. And be sure to follow along and subscribe to wherever you get your podcasts if you've enjoyed this episode. And also be sure to check out our upcoming events. We've got Wool Week coming up at the end of the month, so that'll be the last full week of April, ending on May Day. May Day is also another event. And further on that, check our calendar for all of the great, exciting events we've got coming up this summer.
Yes, thank you very much, and please do come to the museum. When we share our sheep, I think it's more entertaining than any movie out there and more drama-filled, depending on what the sheep is doing.